Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another All Out Leadership podcast, continuing great leadership content from the life of David. You're probably going, wow, I had no idea there was so much leadership material in the life of David. How long is this going to be? A little bit longer, just a little bit longer, because the goal of this podcast is really building biblical literacy around leadership. There's a lot of great leadership content that's taught, but our goal here with the All Out Leadership podcast is to give the foundation of biblical leadership to support so many of those great principles that we're taught. So we're building biblical literacy through this podcast. There was a father that was struggling with alcohol addiction, and he had been fighting it, and it was around Christmas time, and he was just feeling depressed. And so he slipped out while his family was distracted with all the things around the house, and he slipped out and started to walk in the snow to head down to a corner liquor store. And the snow was deep, and he'd take a footstep, and it would sink about a foot into the snow, and he just heard the sound of snow falling, his feet crunching. But then as he listened, he noticed another set of footprints crunching in the snow behind him, and he turned around to look behind him, and it was his 5-year-old son. His 5-year-old son was jumping into each of his footprint, following his dad. And he said, "Hey, Dad, look, I'm following in your footprints." The father immediately sobered up and realized that if his son continued to follow in his footsteps, where it would ultimately lead his son. And from that moment on, his father never took another drink. He sobered up because the reality of his example and the impact that it was having on his family. The next leadership principle that we're going to see is leadership by example, and we see that in the life of David. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 14. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. You may not be the brightest, smartest, have the most degrees or most networked, but if the Lord's with you, you're going to have great success. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. David was given a charge of a group of men, about 1,000 soldiers, and he was sent out in battle. Now, Saul was actually hoping that David would end up being killed because he was threatened by David's success. But David had great success wherever he went, and he would lead these troops into battle, much like a lot of military heroes are known for. General Patton was often known as leading his troops into battle. And so David was out front. He wasn't calling commands from a lazy boy back safe in the bunker. He was out front leading his troops. Leadership by example is the greatest form of leadership that we can have. I like what Albert Einstein said. He said, setting an example is not the main means of influencing others, it's the only means. There was a survey conducted by Opinion Research Corp, and they asked American workers to select the one trait that was most important for a person to lead them, and the number one ranked trait was leadership by example, second to strong ethics and morals. Paul echoes this to his young protege, Timothy, who is pastoring a church of Ephesus, which many theologians believe it could have been upward of 50,000 people in this Ephesus congregation that he was leading. And he says this, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example to the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity." You've heard the saying, people don't do what we say, they do what we do. What we do is more important often than what we say. We can teach leadership, but here's a saying that we'll often use among our staff, and it's leadership is more caught than taught. Leadership is more caught than taught. I'm going to pass on as a reminder for some of you this might be new, 4 steps of leadership development that John Maxwell gives, and it's how you develop leaders. And he starts with this one, which is example. I do, you watch. So you're going to watch me, you're going to shadow me. I'm going to show you how we do whatever this particular task, whatever this particular function is. I'm just going to do it and you watch. The second thing is we're going to go ahead and just do it together. We're going to be side by side. We're going to work on this project. We're going to execute whatever this is. We're going to do it together. And then you're going to do it and I'm going to watch. And then ultimately the goal is to release them to be able to do it on their own. So let's say you're a mother and you're wanting to teach one of your kids how to cook. Hey, watch how I do this. Then, hey, let's do this together. We're going to cut the vegetables together. We're going to make this soup together. And then you go ahead and do it. And I'm just going to stand on the sidelines. I'm going to kind of coach as you go. And ultimately, when you're at the point where you can do it on your own, you can go solo. I'm going to empower you to go solo. You can apply this principle in every part of your life, whether you're a parent leading children, whether you're leading on a staff, you're leading an organization or company, you're a volunteer leading inside of the church. Example is the first and primary way that we lead. We teach what we know, but we reproduce what we are. We teach what we know, but we reproduce what we are. That's going to be in a future leadership podcast where we're talking about David and the law of reproduction, but that fit right here in leading by example. All right, some great food for thought on how we can influence others by starting with ourselves. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.